Ciao, and welcome to Silly, Sexy, and Sadistic History. I'm Rose, and we're about to get weird with history. Today's episode, I'm taking you to Renaissance Rome, which is why I started off with that very pretentious ciao, because that's how Italians say hello. So what the heck are we going to be doing in Renaissance Rome? Well, we're going to be talking about the first same-sex marriage ever recorded in Western Europe. But, as I do, before we get down into it, let's give a little bit of historical context. So what the fuck was Renaissance Rome like? Well, Rome is in the middle of the Italian peninsula, but during the Renaissance, Italy was not one united nation, but a bunch of, city-state nations. Florence had its own thing going on, and Milan had its own thing going on, all ruled separately. And then you had Rome in the middle of the peninsula that was ruled by the Pope, and the Pope kind of had power over everybody to some extent because he was God's representative on earth. So pretty fucking powerful dude. And because Rome was where the Pope lived, Rome had a little bit of extra prestige. A lot of the big Renaissance artwork pieces and architecture feats and whatnot happened in Rome. So think the Sistine Chapel ceiling by Michelangelo and the big beautiful churches. Another really important part of the Renaissance, which came out of Italy, was the idea of humanism. And that's kind of every person in a society should learn the humanist studies, like grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, moral philosophy, what have you, so they could participate in their own society and government. Another huge part of the Renaissance was religion itself. So during this period, there was the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. And the Reformation was this guy, Martin Luther, was like, fuck you, Pope, I can read the Bible and figure out what God has to say to you myself. And the Counter-Reformation was like, no, you fucking can't. You can't do that. These are all the rules you have to follow to be a good Christian. So there was just a lot of social turmoil about whether you were Protestant, i.e. following the teachings of Martin Luther and thought that regular people could read the Bible and interpret the Word of God, or you're more Catholic traditionalist that thought only learned men who had spent their lives devoted to the faith could possibly understand what God had to say and interpret his word. And the Pope was God's representative on earth, and all the very traditional Catholic ways of doing things were the right and only ways to do them. Alright, so that was a very general idea of what was going on in the Renaissance in Rome, culturally. To be more specific, though, what the fuck was going on with getting married? Could gay people just get married if they wanted to? Well, definitely not. That was not okay. Homophobia. It's not new. Back in medieval times, marriage was actually pretty chill. The government didn't get too involved. The church didn't get too involved, unless you were royalty or some shit. But for regular people, they're just living out their peasant lives, hoeing fields and shit, you could just be like, hey, I'll marry that person. The person would be like, alright, I'll marry you. And then they just are married, basically. You take a vow to each other, but that's the main thing. Witnesses were helpful in case somebody decided to dispute your marriage but weren't required. Consummation of the marriage or sex was also important, but again, not necessarily required. And taking communion at church was seen as a way of making your marriage spiritually official, but if you didn't do that, it didn't mean you weren't married socially. Alright, so that was in medieval times, but then when the Renaissance happened, things started to change a little bit. Both the church and state tried taking more control over marriage. So the state wanted to have more of a say in it, so making marriage more of a legal process instead of just two people, hey, I like you, let's be married. No, the state's gotta be okay, you two can get married, because they wanted to have more say in the economics of it. So dowries and inheritance and titles and lineages and making sure royal blood stayed pure or whatever, the state wanted to be able to have power there. And then the church, partly in response to that Reformation, where people were starting to question the authority of the Pope and saying I can talk to God on my own, I don't need you. The church wanted more control in general, socially, and specifically over social morality. So marriage is definitely a way to control social morality. You got things like monogamy and divorce and bigamy and incest and adultery, or even sex for pleasure within marriage. Those are all things the church wanted control over. So making marriage requirements stricter, the church took more control of marriage as well. So during the Renaissance, especially in that later period following the Reformation, marriage became a lot more regulated. And now modernly, basically the only social contract the general public enters into is marriage, or like civil union or whatever, but with kind of like a same goal, a romantic uniting of individuals. However, there was this other thing back in the day, medieval Renaissance time period, called effrayment, and this was specifically a Catholic ceremony, but it was an elective or adoptive brotherhood, and this was common all around the Mediterranean. And this could be two men related to each other or not related to each other, or it could be many men, a whole group of them, and this effrayment contract that they entered into united their whole families. So it wasn't just like, I'm a man, that's my buddy, we're gonna be forever bros. It was like, no, we're gonna like live in the same house and share financial resources. I mean, that wasn't required, but it was pretty common. So I mean, to me that just sounds like a fucking poly party, but sure, brothers. So those were kind of the two social contract options. But then what was homosexuality like in the Renaissance? Well, it didn't really exist as a concept. I mean, it certainly existed as in there were homosexual acts, but there wasn't an identity of homosexuality. There was like the sin of sodomy that people could participate in, but that didn't alter their sexual identity, because the concept of sexual identity didn't really exist. In addition, in regards to the concepts of sexuality, there was this idea in a lot of Europe, especially Mediterranean Europe, like from ancient times, like all the way back to the ancient Greeks, that the sexual relationship was more about power dynamic than genitals necessarily. So it was very commonplace in ancient Greece for higher status men to have lower status or younger men as, well, for lack of a better term, their bottoms. And although that was anciently the case, it was also probably the case in the medieval and Renaissance time period, but it wasn't socially acceptable. Like, sodomy was still a sin, and the church would still hunt you down if they found out you were having butt sex with dudes and you were a dude. For instance, in 1566, so like 10 years-ish before this same-sex marriage I'm going to talk about in Rome happened, Pope Pius IV began like an actual campaign against sodomites. In addition to the power dynamic type of same-sex relation, there's also just lots of evidence for a lot of same-sex sex and love throughout the Renaissance. So like Michelangelo is pretty well accepted to have been at least a little bit gay. Like, you see some of his statues, and you're like, damn, that guy was thinking about how sexy that man was when he was making that statue. Or the fact he, drew naked dudes all over the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or there's even, like, letters back and forth between Michelangelo and some men that were clearly romantic interests. So anyway, church was like, no gay shit. People were like, sometimes maybe gay shit, especially if the person getting fucked is of lower social standing than the person doing the fucking. And marriage was getting very much controlled by the church and state. And that's kind of the general context we're working in for this first ever same-sex marriage extensively recorded in archival material. At the end of July 1578, it was probably hot as shit in Rome, and next to San Giovanni de Porta Latina, a church where a wedding had just taken place, there was a group of friends gathered, celebrating new love, making dinner in the courtyard, and getting to know new arrivals. There was 11 men in total. Most of them had spent years living in or around San Giovanni de Porta Latina. They were supposed to be celebrating the marriage of 2 couples that day, but a member of one of the couples had fallen ill and did not attend, so they were just celebrating one marriage that was between 2 men. And San Giovanni de Porta Latina wasn't just some rando neglected church that no one with power was paying attention to. It was actually had a brand new fancy pretty expensive altarpiece and was actually like a pretty important church in Rome. So some church official almost definitely knew there was some gay shit going on. And so in this marriage that took place in San Giovanni de Porta Latina, one man was dressed normally and one man was dressed as a woman. So there's all sorts of interesting things going on there. So we think back to the historical context bit about how sexual relations were more based on power dynamic than actual genitals. So if one person was taking on a male role and one person was taking on a female role, then it became more about the power dynamic, and that was seen as a little more acceptable, I guess. And then also the participant presenting as feminine was called a camere, which is like a passive feminine version of a word that means like one who is cared for or adored. And this is another really interesting bit because you actually have people creating language to identify outside of gender relationship norms. And this type of coded language was probably also very important for creating and protecting the community of people who are participating in these marriages and sort of forming a brotherhood of their own like-minded fellows. So there they were, just hanging out post-wedding, eating snails, drinking wine, making some dinner at their friend's courtyard, and the gate bursts open and city guards storm in, proceed to insult, harass, beat, and arrest all of the men there. 3 of them, fucking narcs, they did not get in trouble, and 8 went to trial and were hanged for sodomy. And the defense didn't even try to argue the sodomy didn't happen. They did claim that this was just about carnal relations and not marriage. It was just like, oh, we just hang out in the church before we go have sex. It's totally normal and makes complete sense. But this claim that it was just about sex and not about an actual ceremony that was important to these people was weakened by inconsistencies in testimony and the accused saying contradictory things about what the day's events had meant to them. And as always, I've kept a pretty light, sarcastic tone throughout this, but honestly, some pretty terrible shit happened to these guys. One of the latest surviving trial fragments describe the accused men too weak from torture to even be able to stand before the judge. So, yes, this is an awesome story, and these guys were super cool, but fuck, humans are terrible to each other. Just torture someone near to death because of who they wanted to have sex with and who they wanted to connect themselves to. In the end, after 3 weeks of interrogation and torture, all 8 men confessed to a priest, attended mass, and took communion, and each declared he wished to die a good Christian. This can either be seen as just bullshit, a forced confession, basically, or it can be seen as a representation that the faith and commitments that these men made under that faith actually did matter to them, which is cool in its own way. Like, yes, obviously, they would be swearing allegiance to the very ideology that figured they couldn't be alive because of who they were. But if they really did have a faith in the Catholic Church, I would also ascribe much more meaning to the ceremonies that took place in San Giovanni della Porta Latina, because they would have had an actual spiritual significance for the men and really actually demonstrated love between them. All 8 men were hanged on August 13, 1578 in front of Castel Sant'Angelo, and then their bodies were taken to Porta Latina and burned. And according to one newsletter from Rome to outside city's ruler, the trial records were also burned with the bodies because this was like such a shameful, terrible sin that a damnatio memoriae was required. So destruction of memory, basically. Wanted to forget about it completely. But there was obviously some records left over, probably just like trial transcript copies done by judicial officials. Anyway, that's how these men met their horrible end. But how did they get here? Well, thanks to these super awesome couple articles I found on this exact story, I'm able to tell you a little bit about every single one of the 11 men that were arrested that night after the wedding making dinner together. I'll start off with the verified couples. So there was Battista and Alfonso de Robles. Battista was an Albanian boatman. So he'd been around traveling on boats and stuff and had ended up in Rome. And Robles was actually married to a woman from Northern Europe, and he had some of the most money of the group and was considered one of the group's leaders. And Battista and Robles had been fooling around since the mid-1560s, so about 10 years, when they met in Northern Europe, and they had been accused of sodomy twice there, and assumedly they had escaped from Northern Europe to avoid those sodomy charges and gone down to Rome. Robles actually paid for the feast and the wedding ceremony and stuff from that day, and in the end, Robles did write a letter to his wife while he was in prison to be delivered upon his execution, begging her forgiveness. So, complicated situation there. Run away with your male lover and then get hanged in Rome. Very medieval soap opera. Next, we have Antonio de Velez and Cristobal Ribera, and they had known each other for years, having met as soldiers in Sforza Castle in Milan, so they were just two soldiering buddies who also just kind of loved each other and had sex. They considered each other compañeros, so like a very close relationship, and Ribera had actually left for Venice 2 weeks before everyone got arrested, so he was safe up there, and when he had left, Ribera and Velez had exchanged gifts, and it had been a very emotional parting. And then we have the almost couple of Gaspar Martin de Vittoria and Giuseppe, who were meant to marry on that same day where everybody was arrested, but Giuseppe ended up being sick, so he didn't show up. Martin was also the only one who didn't make a deposition because he wanted to, quote, leave no memory, which makes sense because not only was he left at the altar, but he got arrested on his wedding day. Then there was Cristobal Lopez and Friar Bautista Caviedes, who were married on the day of the arrest, so like they were the couple that everyone was celebrating. And they're also both fucking narcs, so these guys were newer to the club, obviously because they hadn't been coupled off yet, so they turned against the other wedding attendants and testified against them and said they like forced them into this marriage or something, and they were just all horrible sodomites. There's a couple single people there as well, so Francisco Ferreira was also new to the social group, and also a fucking narc. However, according to other testimony, Caviedes himself had actually been initiated into same-sex love rooms in the palace of a cardinal. So that's like someone with a lot of power within the Catholic Church. Was also up to some pretty gay shit. Another single individual joining this party was Jerome de Paz. He was a young hermit, and he also possibly conducted the ceremonies. So these weddings, because of the religious significance of hermits. So a hermit's someone who chooses to live a very isolated existence, and because of that isolation, they become more holy. However, I'm confused with that definition here, simply because he appears to be a pretty social guy, hanging out with these other guys. So I don't really get how he's a hermit, but that's what the sources say. Another one of the group's leaders was Marques Pinto, also a single man, and he was from Portugal. And he did confess that he wanted to marry Cristobal, which is unfortunate because Cristobal is the one that testified against them all. However, this confession actually confused the judges, because up until this point the judges kind of thought the marriages were just like an initiation ceremony into a secret society, like a secret sexy society, I guess. But Pinto insisted that these marriages were performed just when we had sex with one another. So they had nothing to do with like an overall brotherhood. They were just like a way to initiate a sexual relationship. Pinto himself actually lived at Puerto Latita Church, probably as a custodian, taking care of things physically and ecclesiastically and, making sure the church was organized and ran well. And this is an interesting quote here from one of the people that testified against Pinto. He held that place to bugger, and that he buggered many young men, and there I think that he also buggered some Jews who frequented that place, and he tried to bugger all those who ended up at San Giovanni, where he lives, and makes there the art and profession of buggery. So according to Pinto himself, and this guy talking about him, he was there for the D. Our 10th wedding celebration attendant is Bernardino del Faro, and all I know about him is that he confessed under torture. And then lastly, there's Francisco Herrera, who was the newest noob of the group, and most people wouldn't even talk about their sexy gay activities in front of him. Now that we know pretty much what happened, I think it's interesting to look at what everybody thought about it. So I have some reactions to kind of go over here. I'll start off with some newsletters from Rome to those other sovereign cities in Italy. And these newsletters were basically like newspapers for the powerful, because mass print did not yet exist. In a newsletter from Rome to Venice, the writer said he saw 11 men be arrested at Porta Latina, where they performed some ceremonies and with horrible wickedness that disfigured the whole name of marriage and married one another before going to bed as husband and wife. So that's pretty obviously not a positive reception of what went on there. Another newsletter from Rome said that the men at Porta Latina testified to have been doing this for 12 years and in many parts of Italy, which is really interesting because it kind of hints at a network of men looking for same-sex relationships and participating in them all over Italy. Another newsletter from July 30th, so that would have just been a couple days after the arrest, said the men were arrested in a vineyard outside of Porta Latina. They had with them some young countrymen, and after excessively eating and drinking when inebriated out of some unprecedented heathenism, they got married and went to be together. Since His Holiness is most angry, there is reason to think that they will be burned alive. I think the interesting part of this quote is the young countrymen bit, because it sets like a predatory motive, like these men were taking advantage of these young men, and or also hints back to that idea of sexual relations is more about a power dynamic, so it would make sense that these men wanted to be with these young men. In my sources, I wasn't able to find out what the actual ages were of these guys, but the historical record can't really make claims either way. And one last quote to just really show how much these people really just hated same-sex sex. We have one newsletter that mentioned the monstrous, abominable, and nefarious vice which led the men to be executed. For another perspective, we turn to Montaigne, who was a French guy that visited Rome 3 years later, and he wrote about the story in his travel journal after a local told him about it. Montaigne's description is as follows. A few years before, certain Portuguese had entered into a strange brotherhood. They married one another, male to male, at Mass, with the same ceremonies with which we perform our marriages, read the same marriage gospel, and then went to bed and lived together. Now, this is a way different tone than those newsletters. He's not calling them evil and vile and repulsive, and he's recognizing the commitment they made to each other as marriage. And it wasn't just went to bed together, it was lived together. So this version of the story is very much so more like this was same-sex marriage, not just same-sex sex. And Montaigne didn't even have anything bad to say about the gayness. He was just like, yeah, that's what happened. One of my sources also argued this event caused a political response as well, because all of the arrested men were Spaniards or Portuguese, but mostly Spaniards. And though Spain was allied with the church, and so Rome, there was like constant maneuvering for advantage because Spain had a lot of influence on the Italian peninsula. So a lot of those rulers of other city-states on the Italian peninsula were ruled by Spanish royal families or people related to Spanish royalty. So anyway, this whole affair made Spain look really bad, and because Spain wanted to keep their power on the Italian peninsula, it encouraged the expedient formation of the Most Holy Resurrection. It was a group of guys representing the people of the Iberian Peninsula, so like Spain and Portugal, that lived in Rome, and its foundation perhaps became more urgent in order to reassure the shocked city of Rome and clean the name of the Spanish nation sullied by the infamous transgressions at San Giovanni a Porta Latina. Beyond having the 8 men executed, the church had another really interesting response to the whole affair. There used to be a painting at San Giovanni da Porta Latina that showed, and I quote, those Spanish who dressed some young man of their nation as girls so that they were not recognizable and married them within that holy church. This painting was meant to induce revulsion and horror. And then, what do historians have to say about all this now? Well, there's the school of thought that I've been kind of approaching this from, which is that this was the first known case of same-sex marriages documented substantially in archival materials, and that was argued by Marcocci. There have also been arguments for these ceremonies just being initiation rites into a brotherhood society, but these societies were also sometimes used as a cover-up for same-sex relations anyway, and I think the evidence kind of better supports that there was something more going on here than just a sex club. But no matter how you look at these proceedings, this is undeniably a story that makes it very evident homosexual desire and homosexual love is not a modern invention. Well, thank you for going on that journey to Renaissance Rome with me. I had lots of fun there. I hope you did too. As a bisexual, surprise, some family members out there listening, this episode also meant a lot to me personally, and thank you for listening to it. If I entertained or informed you even just a little bit, please like and or subscribe and or comment. Please ask me any questions if you want me to talk more about something, or if it seems like I fucked up somewhere, please tell me. I only want to give out the best information possible, so let me know how I can improve. My sources this week were just 2 academic articles, citations down in the show notes if you're interested in checking them out. I found them on Jstor. They were super fascinating and have a whole bunch more information I couldn't even cover. I was just so stoked when I stumbled on this story. I just couldn't wait to tell you guys. Again, I hope you enjoyed it too. Stay silly, sexy, and sadistic, but only with consent.